Hi, I'm Matt Driscoll, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Like many of you, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced us to change the way we work, with many of us working from home. And we here at Asian Aviation are no different, and we're relying more and more on the online channels like Skype or Zoom or other ways of talking to people during these lockdowns that many of us are living through. As a result, we wanted to keep you informed about the news and the people making the news in Asian aviation. And to that end, we started a new series of web videos called In Conversation, where we talk to aviation leaders from Asia and around the world so that you can see them on our website and hear straight from them what's making news and what's in store for the aviation industry tomorrow. I'm very pleased today that for the debut episode of the In Conversation series, we've got Conrad Clifford, the Regional Vice President for Asia Pacific at the International Air Transport Association. We had a very interesting discussion about the problems facing airlines in the region and globally, and how many of the airlines are coping and what the future holds. I hope you'll find it worth your time. As always, please log in to AsianAviation.com for the latest news on the industry in Asia, and feel free to get in touch with us on Facebook or our Twitter feed, or of course via the website. You can also download the latest issue of the magazine in a PDF format from the website. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you find these In Conversation videos beneficial as we all try to weather this storm. Thank you. Hi, welcome to AsianAviation.com. I'm Matt Driscoll, editor. We're here in Singapore. We're in lockdown like everybody else in the world. Welcome to our first In Conversation series here on AsianAviation.com. We're very pleased and honored to have Conrad Clifford. He's the Regional Vice President for Asia Pacific for the International Air Transport Association, or IATA, as everyone calls it. Welcome, Conrad. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's address the elephant in the room. The COVID-19 pandemic it's conquered the world in many ways, and it's decimated the aviation industry. Right now, can you just give us a snapshot of where we stand today, who's flying, what kind of job losses we're looking at, just sort of an overall picture for, you and I, we cover this industry every day.
Yeah.
But give us an idea for the people who don't cover it every day, where things stand and what's happening.
Yeah. Well, Matt, thanks very much for having me here today. This pandemic is absolutely unprecedented. We made a prediction about 3 weeks ago of the impact that it would have for this year on airline revenues. And we've had to revise that forecast because it's carried on getting worse and spread, of course, around the world now. So we announced on Tuesday that we expect the impact for this year on 2020 passenger revenues to be a negative 314 billion US dollars. That's 48% reduction. I can't think of any industry that's been affected so badly in such a short time as has happened with the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's the global figure. For Asia Pacific, we're seeing a 50% reduction in passenger revenues, 113 billion US dollars. So the only bright spot in all of this, if you can call it that, would be cargo. Cargo is holding up well, but the actual volumes are massively reduced because cargo tends to travel not just on freighter aircraft, but also on the bellies of passenger aircraft. In April, we saw an 80% global reduction in aircraft movements. So you can imagine there's no belly capacity available. Interestingly, we're seeing airlines actually refit passenger aircraft to carry cargo. And cargo is so important because, of course, medical supplies, medicines, masks, all these essentials to fight the pandemic are carried as air cargo. It's essential to the global supply chain and to bringing COVID-19 under control.
Yeah, I want to come back to cargo in a little bit because I just actually did a story about that. It was very interesting, and you made a very good point about people converting the passenger cabins to cargo.
Yeah.
the pandemic has obviously it's not just a business problem, but it's a people problem. In aviation, we also IATA in one of its good conferences, media conferences, as I said earlier, I have to give you a compliment. I think the organization is communicating very well with its constituencies.
Thank you.
But it affects people. I wrote in an editorial not too long ago that all the memes on Facebook and Twitter that you see with all the funny things about the virus, or I like them just as well as the next guy, but IATA had talked about at least 25 million job losses. People are
Yeah.
losing. Not only people are dying, that's the most serious
Yes.
aspect, but people are losing their jobs.
Yeah.
What is the aviation industry looking at? I think, again, the figure was 25 million
Yes.
jobs at risk, but that spills over into other areas. Is that correct?
Yeah, that 25 million. So globally, aviation, and here we're talking about all aspects of aviation. So hotels, all of the associated industries, accounts for about 65 million jobs. And we're saying that 28 million of those jobs are at risk. That includes airlines that are a small portion of that, but it also includes all of the other people in the global aviation activity. So it has a massive impact globally. Here in Asia Pacific, it has an even bigger impact because around 11 million of those jobs will be at risk here in Asia Pacific. I think everybody knows how we have a big tourism industry in this part of the world. Countries like Thailand are kind of global leaders in getting benefits from tourism, for example. We've also got the biggest cargo moving airlines, in Hong Kong and so forth. So unfortunately, in Asia, we're hit more than twice as hard as the next region, which would be Europe, around 5 to 6 million job losses. So this is a really big impact for all of those people. And of course, as we also know in Asia Pacific, you take away one job and you're taking away the breadwinner for probably 5, 6, 8 people. So it has a disproportionate impact on people's well-being.
Uh, your boss, IATA Director General Alexandre de Juniac. My
Yeah,
wife is French, so I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
it's very good.
He's been a very good communicator on behalf of the industry. Again, with all the regular updates and things like
Yeah,
that, and he is a force for the industry. I've been covering the industry for 5 years,
mm,
and he's out there every day working on behalf of the industry.
mm,
Um, so we kind of know what he's doing. He's the head of things.
yeah,
But in Asia Pacific, especially now with the lockdown, you're working from home. I'm working from home,
yeah,
which I do always anyway, unless I'm going to a conference or an air show, of
yeah.
which there are none right now.
Yes, that's right.
But
Yeah, exactly.
what
Yeah.
is your basic day like now that you're working from home, and how
Yeah.
are you coordinating IATA throughout Asia Pacific?
Yeah. So there are really two aspects to my job. One is internal and one is external. On the internal side of things, I'm coordinating with, we have 13 offices in 14 countries, as well as the major sort of hub here in Singapore. So it's liaising with all of the leadership teams within those groups on a daily basis. I'm writing to stakeholders, talking to stakeholders, having media interviews like this pretty well every day. We're also having varying degrees of online or teleconferences with various governments. So we recently had quite a long session with the Australian government about how to approach this whole problem. So that's the sort of external side of things. Internally, we have 170 people here in Singapore. They're all at home. We have a duty of care to them. We need to keep their morale up. And of course, we're processing payments for airlines across the region and globally, in fact, within this region. And at the moment, we're dealing with refunds more than actually revenues, because of course the activity is much reduced. So there's a lot of communication, a lot of coordination. My day begins at 9:30. Well, it begins earlier, but the business, if you like, starts at 9:30 with a meeting with my regional leadership team every day. Not happily, not at weekends. And that goes through the day with various meetings and phone calls and what have you until 9 p.m. when I have a global leadership team meeting, which actually happens every day. And that's where I talk to Alexander Dejuniak and we discuss what's happening in this region and my peers around the world. So that's a typical working day.
Well, and it's my day has gotten longer too. I mean, I usually work long hours. I get up at 4 in the morning because it's a good time to have some time alone, and I get all my emails done and everything else. But the problem is now everybody's having webinars, and so
Yes.
and they're all at 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 11
Yeah.
o'clock in the evening.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I fell asleep during the last one, but thank God I was recording it. So I want to come back to you about a couple of things. One, Australian government and refunds, but let's move ahead as well.
Yeah.
IATA has been talking a lot about aid for the airline industry,
Yes. Yeah.
which is, that's the question du jour. Which airlines are going to survive? Which are better capitalized? Are the LCCs going to survive? What's going to happen? Of course, we all know if some genius comes up with a vaccine tomorrow, then things might slowly return back to normal.
Yes. Yeah.
Barring that, on relief measures and again, I just saw a news item: Virgin Australia is asking for relief measures from the Australian government.
Yeah.
We're talking. IATA has talked about direct financial support,
Mm.
loans, loan guarantees.
Mm.
Is there one specific type of aid that is more important? Is it a package as a whole? How does that apply to Asia Pacific in particular?
Yeah. So we're really lobbying very hard with governments around the region. Alexander Dejuniak wrote to all of the heads of state in this region to ask them to develop lifelines, financial lifelines for airlines as fast as possible. I've written to all of the ministers of transport, all of the director generals of civil aviation. The issue, there isn't any one formula that we're really pushing. What we're really pushing is action and as fast as possible, because once an airline goes out of business, it's very difficult to revive it. And what we're constantly saying to government is, we know right now that nobody's traveling, but we need to have a viable airline industry at the end of all this. And even now, we still need repatriation flights, we still need cargo. So you've got to ensure that the airline industry survives. And the only way that that can be done is with cash. And unfortunately, usually it's large sums of cash, but quickly. And really, it doesn't really matter what form that takes as long as it's done quickly. And different governments have responded in different ways with different instruments and different conditions. But as long as they're actually making monies available to airlines to ensure that they survive, we're very happy with that.
I may be skipping ahead, excuse me, a little bit on some of these questions. The U.S. has come up with an aid package
Yeah.
for the airlines there.
Yeah.
Australia, Hong Kong bought 500,000 tickets for future use,
Yeah.
and along with a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But along with these aid packages, and even for OEMs like Boeing and Airbus,
Yeah.
are we going to see something like nationalization where governments take a stake in these airlines?
It's difficult to say, and again, it varies country by country. So some states, as they've been putting these measures into place, have been telling airlines that they need to see equity in return. I know I'm not sure what the situation is with America, but I believe they were talking along those lines in the USA as well. But I think it's still really too early to determine whether a kind of a model will emerge from all of this. Right now, it's just about making sure that airlines don't fall over in the short term. What will happen longer term? Difficult to say, because I think this pandemic has kind of thrown everybody into complete confusion. Nobody expected it to get this bad this quickly. Um, so,
Yeah.
so we'll see.
Okay. Um, this happened, I think, about, and correct me on my timing, a month ago or 6 weeks ago or something like that. IATA had called for slot relief. Now, a lot of people, for some people, slots are sort of a black box of the aviation world.
Yeah,
Uh, but we basically, at its simplest measure, an airline is awarded a certain slot to fly from point A to point B. It has to maintain that schedule in order to keep that slot.
yeah,
Okay, is that correct?
yeah. That's correct.
All right.
Yeah,
IATA had asked for, was it blanket relief or was it
blanket.
some kind of, okay, blanket relief of the slot requirements?
Yeah,
And I'm going to combine two questions here into one.
yeah.
Uh, what did, where do we stand regionally in Asia Pacific, and perhaps throw in even some global figures on that? And there was some initial pushback from ACI, the Airports Council International, where they were saying, let's do it on a case by case basis. Uh, Talk to us a little bit about slot relief, and where things
Yeah.
stand with that.
Yeah. So basically, an airline applies for a slot and it gets the slot, and then if it uses it, it has the right to retain it for the following season. And we have an 80-20 use it or lose it. So if you fly on that slot 80% of the time, it's yours in perpetuity as long as you keep. And we have two seasons, winter and summer. So about a month and a half ago, we asked for all of the level three airports globally, and that's the more congested airports, international airports, to provide us with a blanket waiver, because there wasn't a requirement to fly because there wasn't the demand. And airlines were having to fly empty aircraft because they didn't want to lose their slots. And these slots are immensely valuable because, particularly for businessmen, it's all about timing. So if you have a peak period slot, that's worth a lot more than some timing in the middle of the night. Very, very important commercially. So we had that problem. I'm very happy to say that in the end, all of the airports globally, I think there's one exception in West Africa, all of the major, what we call level three airports, have actually given a waiver. Here in Asia, all of them have given a waiver for what we call northern summer, which is this sort of summer period. So that's been very good news. For ACI, obviously I can't talk for them, but one of the things that did, as this kind of progressed, measures that seemed very drastic at the beginning of this epidemic became, well, we've got to, by the middle of the pandemic. So people's appreciation of how serious this was changed as the situation developed. And certainly from our experience, when we were talking to airports in Europe initially, it was like, why do we need to do this? But then as the infection spread into European locations, they totally understood it. So that might explain some of the differences in opinion in the early days, as it were.
Okay. Uh, and again, I'm hopeful thinking here, because we all get enough depressing news on all the different news channels and everything. I'm in the news business, have been forever, but I can only take so much coronavirus news. Uh, a lot of the talk, and again, it's been on IATA's media calls, which again, I compliment you guys on. We've talked about restarting the industry when it's safe to do so, of course. But as the DG, the Director General, has pointed out, you don't just flick a switch and it goes back to work. How is IATA working with Asia Pacific airlines and governments to coordinate things? Are the governments, the regional authorities, are they cooperating? ASEAN, for example, you've got 10 different countries, and Rarely have I seen them agree on a single thing.
Yeah.
But is there sort of an emerging consensus of what would trigger a restart, how it would be coordinated, things like that?
Yeah, and to answer that first question, there isn't yet, but you can see movement in that direction. And like all these things, as the bigger players start to develop policy positions, the smaller players will start to follow. But I mean, in this whole area, we're really guided by the medical experts. So the first priority is to make sure that we do everything required to ensure that everybody remains safe. But what we have been doing, this was one of the things that Alexander spoke about about a week ago now, saying we need to organize regional summits with the key stakeholders to try and look at how could we restart operations when we decide to restart. So we're holding the first of those summits next week. Initially, it's going to be a closed shop because we want people to feel very comfortable to talk about all of the sort of problems that they foresee. But we want to try and come up with how could we restart as quickly and smoothly and effectively as possible. And at this stage, that's going to be as much about how can we get governments to recognize and harmonize with other governments. So, what would it take for people to accept the arrival of flights from another country with passengers that they feel comfortable enough to allow those people to disembark and land in their country? Those sorts of issues. So we're starting that dialogue, but it's very early days. Obviously, we haven't it hasn't started yet, but we need to do that sooner rather than later.
Is this, and I don't hate to, but could this be a philosophical question of, I mean, do you think this could bring governments closer together and more willing to work together because they see the importance of global connections and trade? And when you can't get that necessary equipment or that ventilator or those N95 masks, I mean, is this a chance for them to say, hey, maybe we need to, you know, work together more?
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And the other thing is that we've already seen, I don't want to talk about them, but we've seen governments change their legislation on transfer of goods to facilitate the carriage of medical equipment, goods that might otherwise be hindered by local laws that weren't consistent with international norms. So you're absolutely right. Yes, it does. And we're very hopeful that if we can get like-minded people together, then we could come up with sort of global standards that people could accept, and that would be a big win.
That'd be very interesting too. Again, I listened to another webinar the other night. I think it was late at night, uh, but it was a very interesting webinar. I think Aviation Week. I have to give them a shout out about this. But it was talking about this is not going to be the last virus or the last pandemic we face.
Yeah.
It's going to happen again sometime.
Mm.
How is this going to affect things? I mean, we've seen pictures of. I saw a picture the other day of an airport in Thailand. They had the big red X on these two chairs.
Yeah, yeah,
This chair was green.
that's right.
We have the lines in the grocery stores for
Yeah.
social distancing and things like that. Uh, how is this? Does IATA have any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts about what's going to happen with airport design and even to the effect of what's going to happen with airplane design? I
Yeah.
mean, we've all been on an A320 or a 737, a narrow body plane. You're with not much of a seat
Yeah,
width to it, and
yeah,
you're you're
yeah,
you're you're packed in like sardines, which is not my favorite thing.
yeah.
Do you think that it will change airport design and airplane design, or is that going to be too much money for people to absorb?
I mean, it's very early days to say what will come out. We've been working on the passenger process to try and make some form of standard, but we haven't. That's still work in progress at the moment. But the um, airlines are already operating with a certain degree of spacing, empty seats between people and the back seats cordoned off to provide quarantine areas and so on and so forth. But I think those are very much temporary things to just make the safest environment that we can with the limited knowledge that we have at the moment. I suspect that I was very interested to read that Emirates now have a 10-minute test for COVID-19 that they've launched on flights out of Dubai, and I suspect that could become a requirement, some form of testing, so that you know that the people sitting with you on an aircraft are all negative. And if that's the case, then the whole spacing issue becomes secondary. But of course, then if you are going to do that testing, and I don't know the detail with Dubai, for example, but you're going to need space to do that. That's going to cost money. Who's going to pay for it? How are you going to build the space in there? We would argue that this is very much like security, and therefore it should be the responsibility of states to fund it. But inevitably that there will be arguments about that. But at the moment, I still think it's a bit too early to really say what the how it's going to change. But it will change for sure, and particularly when you think, as you said quite rightly, there will be subsequent epidemics and what have you, and we'll need to have a system in place that can act quickly to guard everybody against those sorts of events.
Well, I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to ask, but I'm 58, and I remember when I first started traveling overseas, I had this sort of yellow
Yes.
card
Yes.
that showed that I'd been vaccinated against yellow fever
That's right.
and all these other things.
That's right.
And I used to have to travel with that. And I think the Director General of IATA had alluded to something like that.
Yes. Yes.
In one of the conferences the other day, that
Yeah.
maybe now we would have to include some sort of a medical visa in the travel documents or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and very much, and it was yellow fever, wasn't it? Because it was particularly, I was running up and down Africa, and basically you wouldn't be allowed into a country unless you had your yellow fever, the proof of your vaccination. So yes, I think that's very likely, and there's been talk in some countries about sort of vaccination or like medical passports. These are all good ideas. The big issue around all of this is privacy and freedom of information. So, which of itself is a big topic. But yes, I would have thought that would make a lot of sense until we can find some kind of vaccine.
There was a lot of discussions globally early on in this whole pandemic, about travel shutdowns, bans on, quote, foreigners coming into the countries. The WHO said that these don't really work. There's been lots of guidelines about how it hampers people like medical doctors and important cargo about medical staff. IATA came out strongly against travel bans, of course, but it seems like everyone did it. Trump, who I'll leave my political opinions aside, but he's bragging about he shut down travel from China and that saved lives and so on and so forth. And you look at the number of countries that have quarantine restrictions.
Yeah.
Even for air crew, I was listening to
Yes.
another cargo webinar the other night.
Yeah.
They're flying cargo flights with multiple crews on board, so that the crew that flies it to point A, the additional crew can fly it back from that point. are the WHO regulations, are they right? Did IATA get it right? Did these countries get it right? I mean, how do we resolve that? Because it's a huge thing.
Yeah, I think, and the biggest problem with all of this was that as the virus developed and spread, nobody really knew what the best response was. And so, and as we saw measures work in one country, other countries would think, oh, well, we'll copy that. And then if they failed, let's say, because of subsequent reinfection, then third countries would think, oh, well, we're not going to bother with that. So there's been a lot of not experimentation, but really trying to come up with the best response that you can, given that it's a very unknown, unprecedented situation. So I don't think there are really any rights or wrongs. And throughout this, I mean, the major thing has been trying to get this epidemic contained and then stabilized. And again, that varies from country to country because in Germany, for example, they seem to have a fantastic healthcare system. They don't seem to have been swamped by the number of cases at all. But in many developing economies where you don't have an incredibly sophisticated medical system, that of itself can be the problem. So I guess in all of this, as airlines, we've always been guided by the health authorities, and we have to do that to minimize infection and illness and death. But I guess at the end of this, no doubt there will be a review or reviews, and we will come up with better solutions, or at least solutions that perhaps could have been implemented more quickly.
This, I'm not trying to give you a trick question or anything, but from everything I've read and from what a lot of people have been saying, there's no documented case of somebody getting COVID-19 while being on an airplane. Is that?
I think there's a handful of instances where it's unknown. There's a very remote possibility that it could possibly, but basically that's in millions and millions of flights.
Right.
You know, so the answer is, broadly speaking, yes, that's correct.
Well,
but there are, you know,
and there's all the questions about people being asymptomatic and
yeah,
traveling across. So hard to know. So
yeah,
okay,
yeah. But we would say that the chances are extremely low. And then, you know, you've got the environment within an aircraft with the air ventilation, all the rest of it. So, but yeah, it's extremely unlikely.
let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about aviation emissions. We have CORSIA coming into effect. People are starting to, measure their emissions voluntarily and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. And 2020 was supposed to be part of that
Yes.
measurement regime. There has been a lot of discussion in the aviation world about changing that. Do you see any? Do you see ICAO coming up with any changes to give airlines a break on their CORSIA-related requirements?
Yeah. Well, we were talking earlier about global approaches, and all of the airlines always favor a global approach because it reduces the complexity of issues, reducing expense, time, and all the rest of it. And CORSIA was fantastic because it was a global approach to carbon emissions with some pretty ambitious targets. And we had 2019 and 2020 as the baseline years. It's pretty clear, as I was saying earlier, in April, we had an 80% reduction in activity. Over the year, we're talking about at least a 50% reduction in activity. It's pretty clear that 2020 can't be a baseline anymore. So, but nevertheless, the fact that everybody is now measuring emissions, which they weren't doing previously, the fact that we have governments and airlines volunteering to curb their emissions is really positive, and we've got to hold on to that. So we are currently recommending that the best approach would be to retain 2019 as the baseline year, because it means a slightly more demanding target, but it will still be viable. If we go for 2020, it would mean something like as a baseline, it means that there's a huge increase in requirement for offsetting for the voluntary portion, which there are two items here. One is the cost, but secondly, it's finding the eligible units to be able to purchase to offset. So there are quite a lot of issues if we were to retain 2020 as the baseline. So
and some of those eligible units were restricted the other day, were they not? Didn't ICAO come out with a restricted list of 6 available units that you could purchase offsets in?
yeah, and I think there's still discussion going on about eligibility. Yeah, so it's kind of slightly. I get the point is that it's not as if there's a kind of limitless eligible pool. That's the problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to assume that unlike SARS, air travel is not going to have this nice V-shaped recovery that we all hope for.
And the main thing driving that is global recession, because with SARS you had that V, and then everything kind of got back to normal. But here you had the down, and then actually this has sparked a global recession. And IMF figures yesterday talking about this is going to be as big as the Great Depression. I don't know whether that's true or not, but nevertheless, that means that this isn't going to be a V. It's going to be a sort of a long haul out of this situation.
Well, and that's amazing to me, because when people talk about the Depression, it makes me think, and I have to mention my mother, because she grew up in the Depression, and she has saved her money like nobody else, and so now she seems to be she's doing fine financially.
Yes.
But she pinched a lot of pennies in her day, and so we're really trying to instill in our son the need for him to save money as well. I was actually going to, we talked a little bit earlier about the airlines of the future, about nationalization and about LCCs. Let's talk about that just a little bit. I know your time's valuable. I want to wrap up with that question and then just maybe go back and talk about refunds and cargo. But and again, I know it's difficult for you to talk about individual airlines, but things like LCCs, are we going to see some consolidation? Are some legacy carriers going to scoot like Singapore Airlines did, or are they going to thrive again once air travel returns, because they've got pretty dense networks?
I mean, LCCs, our LCC members are suffering as much as the legacy members at the moment. So, unfortunately, nobody has sort of escaped the effects of this. What will transpire in the longer term, I don't know. This issue of spacing onboard aircraft would have an impact, but I think with pre-testing and what have you, I think that will probably go away. So hopefully we can count that one out. The other thing that's going to have an impact is the price of fuel, because we've seen a sort of roughly, I think it's 60% reduction in fuel prices this year. And that looks set at the moment to continue over the next sort of 3 years. So that should help airlines get back into the air when this is over. Will the demand still be there in the same way as it was before, particularly for leisure travelers who, of course, are LCCs? That's where the big market is. I don't know. But equally, will business passengers, who are the sort of backbone of the full service carriers, will they have become used to this form of interaction online, and will their FOs just say, their finance directors just say, look, you don't need to travel that much? I don't know. So at the moment, it's anybody's guess as to what will sort of transpire. Definitely, we will see airlines failing or airlines consolidating, but whether it will be a large scale thing, I'm not sure. And one of the things that we've certainly been saying to governments is, if you wanted a competitive industry, you need to make sure that everybody survives. Don't sort of pick off just your national carrier. there are all these other carriers as well. You want a healthy industry.
3 more quick questions. Refunds.
Yeah,
Airlines have been talking about vouchers. I was paying for my helper to go home to the Philippines.
yeah,
I got a voucher. I could probably use the cash right now, but I'm not going to argue.
yeah,
Uh, I think the figure is something like US 35 billion in unused tickets.
yeah,
Obviously, IATA would prefer the vouchers. The airlines would prefer the
yeah.
vouchers. How is that going with various governments in Asia Pacific and then quickly on globally?
Yeah, I think in Asia Pacific it hasn't been such a big issue because the most of the regulation allows for both voucher or cash, and different ways of handling that. It's a big issue in Europe and it's a big issue in America because legislation in those countries doesn't necessarily permit it. So out in this part of the world, it hasn't been that big of an issue. But it's nevertheless where we have been, airlines have been issuing vouchers for agents. It's a big deal because if it's putting you in a tricky position with your clients, that's difficult for some of our partners. So it's not straightforward, but it's not as complicated as it is in Europe or the US.
Um, 2 more questions. Cargo
Yeah,
has had a really rough last few years,
yeah,
even with e-commerce. We've seen rates go up just because people are trying to ship more, whether it's medical goods, whether it's e-commerce or whatever.
yeah.
I've seen new products come out where they're turning passenger cabins into sort of quasi cargo carriers,
Yes, that's right.
like putting a slip cover over a new
Yeah,
couch with
you have a net over a
yeah,
seat, and you have
pockets in
to,
it.
yeah.
Uh, do you think the next, and again, because people are talking about this going into 2021, 2022, perhaps even longer before passenger travel really regains momentum, uh, should I invest in a cargo company? Do you think they're going to be expanding, or is it just kind of they're treading water with the crisis like the rest of us?
Um, that's an interesting one, and I mean it's particularly relevant for Asia Pacific because, of course, we are the big air freight market, particularly North Asia. Um, so at the moment, it's primarily that the capacity is reduced because there isn't the belly capacity from the passenger aircraft, and that's what's pushed up the cargo rates around the region and around the world. Also, there are some advantages to air freight, even if you're domestically in some countries at the moment, you can move it more easily by air than maybe by land. So at the moment, it's very attractive. Will this continue once all the airlines get going again? I mean, I imagine it will move back towards a new balance. So yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure what the answer to that one is. Whether it will continue or not. If we see, I mean, one of the big things everybody now is purchasing online, and so for those markets that perhaps didn't seem to be so online friendly, now everybody is. So that is undoubtedly going to assist air freight, and so I would imagine that in terms of will people go back to physical shopping in the same way? Probably not. So there's probably a sort of an upside there. But once you get all the belly capacity coming back in with passenger aircraft, you'll see pressure on rates again, I would imagine. And the other thing is that in the supply chain world, so things like mobile phones, which have always been carried by air, will we see America putting more production into places like Mexico? So will the freight balance change geography? Don't know. So those are other considerations.
Well, that's a good point because my wife works for a a fashion company here in Singapore, pretty well known, and we were talking about supply chain the other day because I've actually got to do a story for it for the magazine.
Mm.
And I was telling her that if this continues for a long time, people are going to look at shifting where their manufacturing bases are. They may still use China,
Yeah,
but they may shift to Vietnam. They may shift to Cambodia. They may shift. You spread the risk like any good
yeah,
insurance adjuster
yeah,
or investment banker. You want to spread the risk a little bit.
yeah.
So they may do that. Last question, Conrad, and I appreciate your time. I always like to, when I write my viewpoint columns for the magazine, I always like to look for something positive.
Yes.
Is there a bright spot? Give us some positive news about the industry in Asia and globally, and something we could end this interview on a bright spot.
Well, I think it's this issue of governments working together because there aren't many issues on which you can put a whole bunch of people in a room and everybody is we want to solve this problem. So in that respect, I think this is really positive. And if we can use it to facilitate and smoothen cross-border flows of people and goods and increase understanding and reduce the sort of suspicion between countries about, do they really do the checks properly or don't they? This could actually be a very, very positive moment. And I think particularly for groupings like ASEAN, this might be the time when they actually start to think, well, you know what, we've got to get this problem sorted out. Let's do it. So I think that for me, and as I said, we've seen a few instances of this. So I think that could be a really positive thing to come out of this.
Conrad Clifford, Regional Vice President, Asia Pacific for the International Air Transport Association. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much, Matt. Pleasure talking to you.